Millionaire sees blind elderly woman sinking in floodwaters while a boa constrictor wraps around her. Comment telling me what you thought of this story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and tell me what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story, and I want to get to know you better, so subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. Newark never seemed so gray to me as on that March afternoon. I was standing on the curb of Maple Street, watching the water rise, slowly, methodically, as if it had all the time in the world to swallow the city. My car, a German sedan that cost more than most of the houses around there, was bogged down up to the hood. My cell phone had died 20 minutes ago. I wasn't there to help anyone. I was there because life had put me in that exact spot at that exact moment, and I had nowhere else to go. That's when I saw the snake, a massive boa constrictor, gliding against the current, wrapped around something that took me 3 seconds to realize was a person. An elderly woman with a white cane lost in the muddy water, her arms crossed over her chest, motionless as the floodwaters rose past her waist. The animal wasn't attacking, it seemed to be guiding her. It was too disturbing to make any sense. I waded into the water without sinking. Instinct spoke louder than hesitation. I don't know if it was courage or just the exhaustion of spending years watching everything from a distance. The woman was light in my arms, far too light. Her skin was cold, her breathing shallow. The snake let go of her when I got close and vanished into the current as if it had never been there. I carried the woman to a raised planter bed and laid her on the ground. She opened her eyes, or rather, her eyelids, because her eyes were cloudy, unfocused, drained of color. Blind. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just gripped my wrist with a strength that didn't match her fragile body and muttered something that hooked into me. "I know who you are. I saw you on the news once, before I lost my sight. You were an honest man." I didn't answer. What could I say? That I used to be honest, that I tried to be, that I was kicked out of the system precisely for that? I just stayed there, holding her wrist, feeling the water rising around my feet and the weight of that sentence sinking into my chest. My name is Edward Carter. I am 44 years old. I was a police detective for 17 years until I was forced into early retirement by a scandal that wasn't my fault. I had been investigating irregularities in city contracts. I got too close to important names. The case was closed in the public interest. I lost my badge, my reputation, my marriage. Everything fell like dominoes. I learned that doing the right thing changes nothing, that the system protects the powerful, that justice is just a decoration for those who already have everything. Since then, I've lived off private consulting. I help corporations resolve internal issues. It pays well. It keeps me busy. It keeps me away from matters that require me to believe in anything. I live alone in a Manhattan penthouse that overlooks the city, but feels like a cell. Thick glass, air conditioning always running, silence bought with a fortune. My sister Rose, who lives down in Philadelphia, calls me every week to ask if I'm doing okay. I always say yes. I always lie. The flood changed that. In the days that followed, the shelter set up at the local public school became my anchor point. Volunteers tried to organize the chaos. Whole families huddled on thin mattresses, kids running between piles of donations, the smell of mold, sweat, and cheap disinfectant. I went back because I couldn't get Martha out of my head. That was her name. Martha, 71 years old, blind for 2 decades. She knew every bump on the neighborhood sidewalks by memory, but the flood had washed away everything she knew. I found out chatting with David, a skinny social worker with crooked glasses and infinite patience, that Martha wasn't just a helpless old lady. She had been for 30 years the housekeeper for the Vance family. Peter Vance. The name dropped into the air like a stone in a still lake. A real estate developer. One of the most powerful men in the metropolitan area. He funded political campaigns. He opened hospitals bearing his own name. He appeared on the covers of business magazines with the smile of someone who never lost a night of sleep. David lowered his voice when he spoke. She lived in a place he paid for. Rent, groceries, everything. But he cut her off the day he found out you rescued her. I felt my stomach turn. Why would he do that? David shrugged, but his eyes said it all. He knew, Martha knew, and now I knew too. That wasn't charity being cut off. It was a warning. Martha was temporarily staying in a spare room offered by Lucy, a kind-hearted neighbor who lived 2 blocks from the shelter. I went to visit her on a sweltering afternoon, the kind that makes the Newark asphalt melt. She was sitting in a plastic chair, her back to the window, hands folded in her lap. She didn't hear me arrive. She only realized I was there when I pulled up a chair and sat next to her. "You came back," she said. It wasn't a question. I came back. Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, that demands something. "Why did he cut off your rent?" I asked. Martha took a deep breath. She took so long to answer I thought she wouldn't. "Because I saw things I shouldn't have seen, and because now you've seen me." "What things?" She turned her face toward me, as if she could see me through the permanent darkness. "Documents, signatures, embezzlement from a housing project promised to hundreds of families. They never got a thing. I worked in his house when I still had my sight. I saw everything." He never said a word, but he always knew that I knew. That's why he kept me close. That's why he paid for everything. It was control. I felt a lump in my throat. And now? Now he knows you're close to me, and that you're not like the others. The others? The people he buys, the people he silences, the people he crushes. I just looked at her. 71. Blind, no family nearby, homeless, left with nothing, and yet unshakable, stronger than I had been in years. "I don't know if I can help," I said. "Too honest, too raw." She smiled, a sad smile, etched with wrinkles. "You already helped. You pulled me out of the water. The rest, we figure out together." Over the next few days, I tried to access old records from my precinct days. Background files on the Vance family, anything that could give me context. I discovered my login had been deactivated, not through standard offboarding, but by a recent administrative order, issued 2 days after I pulled Martha from the water. Someone had noticed my moves. Someone with pull inside the system was still watching me. It felt like being watched by something invisible, a web with a spider in sight. I met Alan and Frank during a group talk at the shelter. 2 freelance journalists, young, idealistic, covering the floods for independent news outlets. Alan had messy hair and a beat-up camera hanging around his neck. Frank talked fast, with a slight country drawl, buzzing with nervous energy. They showed me a photo. An illegal construction permit sign on a lot near the area, hit hardest by the flood. The Vance construction name was right there on the licensing boards. Paving over that land illegally ruined the drainage for this whole suburban basin, Alan explained, tapping his phone screen. Families lost everything because of this. I stared at the image, at the name, at Peter's signature stamped on it like a silent confession. "Are you guys going to publish this?" Frank shrugged. "On small blogs. Not many people will see it, but it'll be on the record." It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Paul showed up on a Thursday night. He was an occasional driver for Peter. A skinny kid, trembling hands, the look of someone who hadn't slept right in days. He tracked me down in the shelter's parking lot, far from cameras, far from witnesses. "I moved boxes of documents he ordered to vanish," Paul said, glancing over his shoulder. "Weeks before the flood, I don't know what was inside, but I know where they went. A storage unit out in Elizabeth, under a shell company's name." I jotted down the address. I jotted down the name. Paul was breaking out in a cold sweat. Why are you telling me this? He swallowed hard. Because I can't get that old lady's face out of my head. The one you saved. I saw her once, years ago, at the boss's house. She was kind to me, and now he took everything from her. Why? Because you helped her? That's just wrong. I held out my hand. Paul shook it quickly and faded into the darkness as if he'd never been there. I had a lead. I had a terrified witness. And finally, I had a thread to pull. But I also knew that pulling this thread would cost me. The storage unit in Elizabeth was already gone. I got there on a Friday morning, the address Paul gave me scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper in my pocket. The place was an abandoned warehouse, doors busted open, windows shattered, graffiti covering the brick walls. I stepped inside carefully, crunching on broken glass and debris. Nothing. Not a single box. Not a scrap of paper. Someone had beaten me to it. Someone knew I was snooping around. I stood in the middle of that empty space, smelling the stale dampness and old gasoline, and realized I wasn't just investigating anymore. I was being investigated too. That feeling of being watched rushed back, stronger than ever. I got out of there fast, checking my blind spots, looking for cameras, strange cars, anything, nothing obvious. But the certainty stuck to my skin like a cold sweat. I headed back to the shelter empty-handed, my mind racing. Martha was sitting in her usual spot next to Lucy, who was knitting something colorful and chatting softly. When she saw me walk up, Lucy quietly got up and slipped away, giving us space. Martha turned her head toward me. "You didn't find anything," she said. It wasn't a question. No. He erases everything, always has. I sat down beside her, too exhausted to fake any optimism. "So how do we do this?" Martha stayed quiet for a long time. Then, with that low voice that carried more weight than a shout, she said, "We rebuild, slowly, with whatever is left." It sounded impossible, but she spoke like someone who had already rebuilt her own life from scratch more than once. Alan and Frank became unlikely allies. We spent days digging through public county clerk records, free satellite imagery, off-the-record chats with locals. It was a slow, grueling grind with no guaranteed payoff. Alan had the patience of a monk. Frank made up for his anxiety with terrible jokes that no one laughed at, but they broke the tension. On a rainy night, sitting on the shelter floor with papers scattered everywhere, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, I stumbled on a forgotten city council meeting minutes logged in a public digital archive. It was just sitting there, unprotected, unencrypted, as if it was too trivial to bother deleting. Peter Vance's signature was right on a project approval that completely contradicted the official story he'd fed the press about the flooding. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was real. It was verifiable. It was devastatingly inconvenient. I showed it to Alan. He read it 3 times before speaking. This inconvenient. I showed it to Alan. He read it 3 times before speaking. This is gold. Frank took pictures of everything, backed it up on 3 different cloud drives, sent a copy to a lawyer he trusted. I just leaned my head against the cinderblock wall and sat there, trying to believe this actually meant something. That's when Martha showed up. Walking slowly, feeling along the walls, finding me in the dim light. She didn't say a word. She just sat next to me, found my hand, and stayed quiet. We sat like that for 20 minutes, maybe longer. No words. Just 2 exhausted people sharing the same space. It was the quietest and heaviest moment of it all. And it was also the moment something inside me finally gave way. Not a collapse, but like armor cracking right before it falls off. Peter's pushback came fast. Rachel, a high-powered attorney on his payroll, walked into the shelter 2 days later, holding a petition for temporary guardianship. The play was slick. Transfer Martha to a private care facility funded by the Vance Foundation, claiming she needed specialized medical care the shelter couldn't provide. The law, at that exact moment, seemed to be favoring the wrong side. David pulled me aside, shaking. "Edward, I don't know what to do. Technically, the paperwork is airtight. If she signs it, I can't stop them." "She's not going to sign. What if they pressure her? What if they claim she's cognitively impaired?" I felt my blood boil. "She's not impaired. I know that, but they have lawyers. They have unlimited funds. They have time." I called Alice, a public defender I knew back from my detective days, a tough, straight-talking woman who never let an injustice slide quietly. I broke down the situation, who was patched in on a three-way call, laugh out loud. "I'll file an injunction to stall this," Alice said. "But Ed, this is going to turn into a brutal legal war, and he has endless resources." "I know. Are you absolutely sure?" I looked over at Martha, sitting across the hall, whispering with Lucy. She had no idea they were trying to drag her away. She had no idea she was the prize in an invisible U, and I couldn't let them take her. "I'm sure." The injunction held them off for 3 days. Just enough time for Peter to pivot his attack. Robert, his fixer, made sure a message with no sender reached my phone. "Your sister down in Philly runs a nice little business. It'd be a real shame if the health inspectors started sniffing around." I stood staring at my phone for 20 minutes, reading that sentence over and over. The exact threat I dreaded most. Not aimed at me, aimed at someone who never asked to be part of this mess. I called Rose. She picked up on the second ring, cheerful, completely clueless. I told her. I heard dead silence on the line. Then her voice came back, furious, cutting like glass. "Are you really going to let that man win again?" It wasn't what I wanted to hear. It was what I needed to hear, and it stung the most because it carried the memory of the man I used to be before I gave up. "No," I said. "I'm not." The surprise inspection at Rose's bakery happened anyway. Trumped-up code violations, outrageous fines, a temporary shutdown order. She called me in tears, not from fear, but from pure anger. "I am not backing down, Ed. Do you hear me? I am not backing down." I dragged that guilt around, like an anvil in my chest for days. Rose drove up from Philly to stand with me, completely ignoring the threats, sleeping on a cot in the shelter like just another volunteer. Her being there cost her dearly, but it also gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time, the shame of even thinking about quitting. The exposé dropped on a Tuesday afternoon. A major news site, quietly backed by Vance's corporate group, ran a hit piece hinting that I had cozied up to Martha for my own shady reasons. They dragged out my old police firing record to paint me as a disgraced, untrustworthy cop. Social media exploded, angry comments, name-calling, people demanding I be banned from the shelter. The shelter's phones rang off the hook. David gave me awkward, silent glances. Stella, the volunteer coordinator who always played nice, used the drama to double down on pushing for Martha's transfer. I seriously considered walking away. Really, for the first time. I sat in my car in the shelter parking lot. My luxury sedan had finally been towed and cleaned up, staring at the roof liner, thinking about how easy it would be to just put it in drive and leave. Head back to Manhattan, close the blinds, ignore the world, let the machine do what the machine always does. Martha was the one who stopped me. She found me out there, tapping her cane against my tire, knocking on my window. I popped the door open. She climbed into the passenger seat and sat quietly for a minute. Then, in that voice that never needed to be loud to hit hard, she said, "I spent 30 years terrified of one man. I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left living like that." I didn't say a word back. I just held her hand and let that mean exactly what it needed to mean. Paul went off the grid for 2 weeks. I figured he'd chickened out, and I couldn't really blame the kid. But he showed back up on a freezing April night, knocking on the shelter doors past midnight, clutching a beat-up backpack. Inside was a burner phone, and on that phone were pictures, dozens of them. Internal memos and ledgers he had secretly snapped inside Peter's private office using a device no one thought to check. It had the paper trails. It had the names. It had enough. "I did this for her," Paul said, glancing over at Martha, "because she doesn't deserve what they did to her." Martha didn't say anything. She just gave him a slow nod, like someone saying thank you without making a sound. Alice got the files the very next morning. Official intake, sworn affidavits, stamped and sealed, the lawsuit dropped. Peter was formally served. His legal army mobilized instantly. But this time, the damage was done. The fortress hadn't been breached by brute force, but by the relentless patience of people who literally had nothing left to lose. And standing in the middle of that slow, grinding, bureaucratic trench war, I realized I wasn't fighting to win anymore. I was fighting to not get beaten again. There's a difference, and it matters. The legal gears turned way too slowly to feel good, but fast enough to be real. Peter Vance was officially indicted on a gray, overcast Thursday. There was no perp walk, no handcuffs, just endless paperwork, stamps, and the absolute certainty that for the next few years, he'd be forced to watch the people he tried to break slowly taking back their lives. The story hit the independent blogs first. Then cautiously, the mainstream networks picked it up, always padded with alleged improprieties and unproven accusations. The polite language they always use to protect the rich. I didn't pop any champagne. I just sat on a park bench across from the shelter, watching kids splash through puddles left by the overnight rain, and felt a bone-deep exhaustion. It wasn't a triumph. It was endurance. And enduring drains you more than anything else. Rose called me crying, happy tears this time. The injunction against her business was tossed out. The fines magically vanished. The bogus code violations were scrubbed from the system like they never existed. The machine shielding Peter was slowly backing off, terrified of getting dragged into the spotlight. It wasn't perfect justice. It was damage control. But I'd take it. "You did it," she said through the phone. "We did it," I corrected her, because if I was alone, I would have folded weeks ago. Martha started to change. Nothing flashy, no grand gestures, just tiny shifts you only notice if you're really paying attention. She started smiling again. Not constantly, but enough. She started telling stories about the New York of the 70s, when parts of Newark were still unpaved dirt roads, about the smell of summer rain mixed with factory smoke, about the old neighborhood saints the grandmothers used to pray to before a bad storm hit. I sat and listened, and for the first time in years, I listened without being a cynic. Without that sarcastic voice in my head tearing everything down before I even tried to believe in it. One afternoon, she asked me, "Do you have a family?" "I have a sister, Rose, down in Philly. A wife, kids. I had a wife once. Didn't last." Martha stayed quiet, waiting for me to elaborate. I didn't. She didn't push it. She just said, "The people who stay are the ones who choose to stay, not the ones who are forced to." I chewed on that for days. Lucy put together a neighborhood raffle to raise cash to fix up Martha's house. The floodwater had wrecked the inside, but the bones of the place were solid. A little elbow grease could bring it back. The donations trickled in. A few bucks here, some drywall and paint there. Weekends full of volunteers swinging hammers. Alan and Frank filmed the whole rebuild, turning it into a mini doc-series that caught fire on social media. It wasn't primetime TV, but it was raw. And sometimes raw beats polished. Rose helped out from Philly, wiring cash she couldn't really spare, but absolutely refused to keep. Martha's daughter Alice, who lived all the way out in Texas and couldn't afford a flight, managed to get a sponsored ticket through a crowdfunding campaign Frank threw together online. She pulled up on a Saturday afternoon, eyes swollen from crying, and hugged her mom for so long I lost track of time. I stood off to the side, watching them, and felt this weird ache in my chest. It wasn't jealousy, it felt a lot like hope. And when you've gone years without it, hope actually hurts before it starts to heal. Peter didn't vanish. Guys like him never do. He kept showing up at charity galas, ribbon cuttings, smiling in glossy magazine spreads, always perfectly tailored, always surrounded by yes men and bodyguards. But the vibe was different. His posture, the way his eyes darted around. He knew people were watching him now. He knew every signature was being double-checked. The armor that kept him untouchable for decades had a crack in it. It wasn't shattered, but it was cracked. And cracks always spread eventually. Robert, the fixer who had threatened my sister, was quietly let go. No press release, no public scandal. He just evaporated from Peter's payroll, swapped out for another guy in a nice suit. Alan did some digging and found out the guy took a cushy job a few states over, basically exiled, to cover their tracks. The syndicate was reshuffling, but now we knew exactly how they operated, and that changed the whole game. Martha's house was finally finished on a Sunday morning. Fresh white walls, clean polished concrete floors, donated furniture, some new, some patched up. It wasn't a mansion, but it was hers, and it smelled like a fresh start. Martha walked in slowly, running her hands along the doorframes, mapping out the rooms in her mind, and just stood dead center in the living room for a long time, totally silent. Then she turned toward me, or at least where she thought I was standing, and said, "Thank you." I didn't know what to say back. I just nodded, completely forgetting she couldn't see me. But I'm pretty sure she felt it anyway, because she smiled. Elon and Frank kept churning out articles, pieces on the flood fallout, the missing funds, the community rebuilding itself. The audience wasn't massive, but they were loyal. Every new article was another cinder block resting on Peter's chest. Every quote from a flooded-out neighbor was a permanent reminder that he didn't get away clean. The court case dragged on at a glacial pace, exactly like you'd expect. But it was moving, and just keeping it alive was a miracle. Alice, the public defender, called me late on a Tuesday. "Ed, you realize this is going to drag out for years, right? He's going to appeal. He's going to stall. He's going to try to buy us off." "I know. Are you ready to deal with that?" I stared up at the ceiling of my Manhattan penthouse, that sprawling place that felt like solitary confinement. The place I bought specifically to hide from the world. Suddenly, it felt way too small. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I know I'm not backing down." She let out a short, exhausted laugh. "You've changed." "I haven't changed. I just stopped pretending I don't give a damn." On a Friday evening, Martha told me to come over for dinner. It wasn't an invite. It was a mandate. "Dinner's on the stove. You're eating here tonight." I showed up around sundown, holding a bottle of wine I bought, without even knowing if she drank. Her daughter Alice, sharing a name with the lawyer, a funny coincidence we all joked about, was at the stove stirring up rice and beans. The house smelled like fried garlic and cilantro. It smelled like home. A smell I hadn't experienced in so long I almost forgot what it was like. We sat down at the table. Martha, her daughter Lucy, and me. 4 people thrown together by a disaster, breaking bread like we'd been doing it our whole lives. We talked about nothing important, the humidity, the forecast calling for more rain next week, Lucy's new rescue cat that kept shredding her couch. Nothing heavy, nothing urgent, just the kind of easy talk you have when no one has anything left to prove. Halfway through the meal, Martha put her fork down, turned her face toward me and said, "You're going to keep coming around, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. It felt like an order. I smiled. "I am." "Good. Because we need someone who knows how to fix a leaky faucet. And you look like a guy who knows his way around a wrench." Everybody at the table laughed, even me. And it hit me that it had been months since I'd actually laughed out loud. Peter Vance would be fighting that lawsuit for years. Maybe he'd plead it down. Maybe he'd never see the inside of a cell. Maybe he'd walk away with a fine, probation, and a slap on the wrist. The system takes care of its own. It always has. But the rules had shifted. He wasn't bulletproof anymore. And the people he tried to bury weren't staying quiet. Martha got her life back, not exactly the way it was before, but a new version of it. Brighter, freer. Her daughter stuck around for a few weeks to help her settle in, then headed back to Texas, promising to fly up for the holidays. Lucy practically lived there, popping over every day. And without even realizing it, I became a fixture there too. I started dropping by 2-3 times a week, sometimes to fix a broken hinge, sometimes just to sit and talk. Martha told stories. I listened, and slowly, I started telling my own. Things I had kept locked in a vault for years. The divorce, the internal affairs investigation that ruined my career. The years of bitter cynicism that turned me into a guy I couldn't stand. She listened without a hint of judgment, just nodding along. And when I ran out of words, she'd say something incredibly simple. Something that didn't magically fix the past, but somehow made it easier to carry. You did the best you could, and now you're stepping up again. That means everything. Newark was still Newark. Gray, gritty, full of messes nobody wanted to clean up. But now, when I drove through those streets, when I saw the water lines still staining the brick walls in the alleys, I felt something different. It wasn't some naive sunshine and rainbows optimism. It was just the quiet realization that nothing is completely broken, that there are still people out there willing to plant their feet and push back, and that pushing back, even when it drains your soul, is absolutely worth it. 6 months after the flood, Newark felt like a different city to me. The pavement was still cracked, the traffic was still a nightmare, and the Passaic River still looked like it wanted to swallow the banks every time it stormed. But I saw it all through a different lens. Not with stupid cheerfulness, just with the understanding that even solid concrete has cracks in it, and sometimes something worth keeping manages to grow in those cracks. Martha turned 72 on a rainy Tuesday. Lucy threw together a modest lunch at the house. Roast chicken, rice, beans, cornbread. Alice, her daughter, flew in from Texas just to stay the week. Alan and Frank crashed the party carrying a supermarket sheet cake and a couple of 2-liter sodas. Rose drove all the way up from Philly, bringing a gift wrapped in brown paper, a heavy crochet blanket she'd made by hand. I brought a bouquet of flowers. Martha couldn't see the colors, but she slowly ran her fingertips over the petals, feeling the velvet texture, and gave that subtle, quiet smile of hers, like a smile was too valuable to just hand out to anyone. We hung out for hours, eating, talking over each other, groaning at the awful jokes Frank kept trying to land. There was absolutely nothing historic about it. It was just ordinary people sitting around a kitchen table, sharing food and killing time. But for a guy who had spent years intentionally avoiding moments exactly like this, it was almost terrifying to realize how much I desperately needed it. The lawsuit against Peter kept grinding through the gears of the justice system. Hearings pushed back, endless motions filed. Legal gymnastics designed specifically to exhaust anyone stupid enough to expect a fair fight. Alice, the public defender, would give me a ring whenever the needle moved, which wasn't often. But just the fact that the docket existed, that the ink was on the page, that it hadn't been quietly tossed in a shredder, meant the world. Peter hadn't been able to make it vanish, and that, no matter how small it felt, was a loss he had to swallow. Alan texted me a link to an article in a regional paper, just a blurb, barely half a page. But it was printed. It outlined the shady zoning approvals on the old housing projects, named Peter Vance directly, and referenced the active litigation. It wasn't a front-page Sunday feature. It wasn't going to topple an empire overnight. But it was on the record. It was a memory. And memories, if you keep them alive long enough, turn into history. It ain't a Pulitzer, Alan said, sounding a little bashful. It's exactly what we need, I replied. And I meant it. I found myself swinging by Martha's place so often it even surprised me. 2, 3, 4 times a week. Sometimes to swap out a flickering porch light. Sometimes to tighten a loose cabinet door. Most times just to sit out on the front steps and listen to her talk. Stories about a version of the East Coast that's been paved over for decades. About rattling streetcars cutting across town, about guys selling fresh fruit out of the back of pickup trucks, yelling down the block, about block parties that went until sunrise, where nobody bothered calling the cops because everyone looked out for each other. I sat there listening, and it dawned on me that I was relearning something I'd completely forgotten. That a life doesn't have to make front-page news to be a good one. You just have to actually show up for it. Pay attention to it. Keep the right people close. One afternoon, out of nowhere, Martha asked me if I was happy. The question completely blindsided me. I sat there mute for a minute, genuinely chewing on it. Finally, I said, "I think I'm trying to be." She grinned. "That puts you ahead of most folks." Rose started making the drive up from Philly a lot more often. She claimed it was just to check in on Martha. But I knew damn well she was keeping tabs on me, making sure I wasn't backsliding, making sure I wasn't morphing back into that bitter, isolated ghost locked in a Manhattan tower. She didn't need to stress about it. I didn't fit in that life anymore. I actually just listed the penthouse on the market. I had no clue where I was going to pack up and move to next, but I knew I couldn't stay up there in the clouds. One night, after polishing off dinner at Martha's, Rose and I kicked back on the porch while Lucy scrubbed plates in the sink, and Martha dozed off in her recliner inside. The air was thick and muggy, carrying that distinct smell of a thunderstorm rolling in. Rose lit up a cigarette, a habit she swore up and down she had quit, and stared out at the dark street. "You're different," she said. "That's what everybody keeps telling me. Because it's the truth. You seem more grounded, more awake." I thought about that. I think I was just dead behind the eyes for a long time. I just didn't notice. She took a long drag. "So what's the plan now?" "Now I'm just trying not to die again." She smiled, flicked the cigarette butt onto the wet concrete, and crushed it under her heel. "You'll be all right. I know you will." I didn't say anything back. I just sat there next to my sister, listening to the muffled hum of the highway and the wind picking up before the rain. Paul showed up one last time, a few months down the line. He looked like a different kid. Dropped a lot of weight, dark circles under his eyes. He told me he walked away from the driving gig with Peter, said he couldn't physically stomach sitting in that car knowing what he knew. He was hunting for a new job. Anything, really. But he said for the first time in months, he was finally sleeping through the night. "Did I do the right thing, man?" he asked, his voice shaking a little. "You did," I told him, and it was the honest truth. He stepped inside to talk to Martha for a few minutes. She reached out, grabbed his hand, and told him he had a brave heart. Paul walked out of that house with tears in his eyes. Not from sadness, from pure relief, like a guy who finally unstrapped a 100-pound vest he'd been wearing for way too long. The March flood faded into the archives. The water lines on the brick walls got painted over. The avenues cleared out and went back to business as usual. The world kept spinning, completely unbothered by everything that went down. But for the people who were actually in it, for the ones who practically drowned in that muddy water, literally or figuratively, nothing ever really went back to normal. I didn't get my detective shield back. I didn't magically regain my faith in the justice system. I didn't transform into some flawless, redeemed superhero. That garbage only happens in the movies. In the real world, you just pick up the shattered pieces. You just try to wake up a little less broken every morning. You just make the choice, whenever you can, to plant your feet instead of running away. Martha passed away 2 years later, peacefully in her sleep, with her daughter and Lucy right by her side. I was out of town on a consulting gig when it happened. Rose called me, sobbing. I booked a flight back that exact same day. The funeral was small, barely a handful of people, but it was the right people. Alan and Frank showed up. Alice, the public defender, was there. Paul sent a beautiful wreath. And me, a guy who hadn't shed a tear in over a decade, I cried. Not a breakdown, but enough. At the graveside, Martha's daughter slipped an envelope into my hand. Inside was a letter typed out in Braille, with an English translation handwritten right over it. Martha had dictated it a few weeks prior, almost like she knew her clock was winding down. It was brief. It just read, "Thank you for not leaving me alone in that water. Thank you for staying." It was a letter typed out in Braille, with an English translation handwritten right over it. Martha had dictated it a few weeks prior, almost like she knew her clock was winding down. It was brief. It just read, "Thank you for not leaving me alone in that water. Thank you for staying. You are stronger than you realize. Keep being strong." I folded that piece of paper, shoved it deep in my coat pocket, and carried it with me every single day for months. I still have it. Peter Vance never did a day of time. The lawsuit ended in a massive, sweeping settlement. Heavy fines, huge payouts, a permanent ban on developing certain zones. It wasn't poetic justice, but it was a hit. And sometimes, a hit is the absolute best you can manage to score against a machine designed to protect guys exactly like him. He still shows up at galas. He still flashes those perfect teeth for the cameras. He still lives the exact same high-roller life. But now, whenever anyone types his name into a search bar, Alan and Frank's articles pop right up. The lawsuit pops up. The digital footprint of what he did is right there. And sure, it's not a jail cell, but it's a permanent stain. It's a crack in the armor, and cracks don't patch themselves. I ended up selling the Manhattan penthouse and closing on a modest little house out in Newark, right down the street from where Martha used to live. Close to Lucy, who became a genuine lifelong friend. Close to a life I never mapped out, but somehow stumbled into anyway. Rose drives up from Philly almost every month now. We grab dinner, we shoot the breeze about meaningless stuff. About Lucy's cat that finally gave up on shredding the upholstery. About the humidity. About absolutely nothing and everything all at once. Alan and Frank are still out there chasing leads, writing stories about the people the city forgot, about quiet, everyday injustices, about small acts of defiance that, when you stack them up, actually build something massive. I throw them an assist whenever I can, passing along tips, shaking down old contacts, using the instincts I sharpened over years of working cases the department desperately wanted buried. I'm not a hero. I didn't save the world. I just did what was sitting right in front of me, and I figured out that when it's all said and done, that's completely enough. That you don't have to fix the entire planet. You just have to fix the little patch of dirt you're standing on. There's this huge pipe